Okay, I think we're going to start the session now. Welcome to this session on open government data and new territories. It's a short talk series. We were planning to have more people on the panel, but this is actually a good thing. We'll have more time to either have a discussion with you in the public and to give more time also to develop some ideas from the panel. My name is Giorgio Pauletto. I'm a member of the Opendata.ch, which is the open knowledge chapter for Switzerland, and I also work in foresight for the Geneva government. So let me welcome you in Geneva first and say thank you for coming all the way. I know that some of you guys come from very far away. Actually, we have people also on the panel that come from very far away, from New Zealand, from all over the world, and from closer also in Europe and in Switzerland. So welcome to you all. We'll have a session that goes on like this. I'll first give the floor to our panel, and then, of course, once the panel has done its presentations, then we'll have an open discussion with you guys. So listen carefully and prepare your questions, and then we want to have as much as a conversation as possible to keep the ball rolling and to start this very nice conference. So without much further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Dirk Helbing from the ETH Zurich, who will talk about Economy 2.0. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. Open data will actually start a new age, I would say, a new age of our society. Many countries in Europe are in a deep economic crisis, and so we need to think about how we organize our economy of the future. And I argue that we can build an economy 2.0, a self-regulating, open and participatory market society. I'm starting off with Egypt as one of the great civilizations. We had more of them, of course, such as Greece, basically the origin of democracy, and Italy, Rome, as the Roman Empire as the starting point of law, still used today in many aspects, but those great civilizations are far in the past, and currently we're not doing a very good job, actually, it seems. So we have a world financial, economic, and debt crisis. We see social and political instabilities in many areas of the world. We are facing global warming, global environmental change, organized crime, cybercrime, emerging diseases, and many other problems, actually, that are standing in front of our door. So it would be good if we were able to understand society better and the driving factors, actually, such as resources, environment, demography, and so on. There is a change coming up now. While in the past we had a lack of data in the social sciences, we are now entering an age of big data of human activities, and the question is, how would that actually change not only science but also our society and our economy? So given this data, what could we do with it? I'd like to go back to an old idea of Adam Smith's, which is the basis of our current economy. In The Wealth of Nations and some other books that he's written, he has actually developed the idea of modern market societies. And one of the main points here is the idea that if everybody would just do what is best for him or herself, that would create also the best state of society. We know that it's not working perfectly. And so the question is, why, after 300 years, are we not able actually to learn how to self-organize our society and our economy as ant societies or beehives and many other social animals can do so? Well, there's certainly an extra challenge, which is the diversity of humans. As I will argue later on, however, the diversity is also the biggest asset. We just need to learn how to deal with it. But anyway, let me give you an example how self-organization can work. So in any pedestrian area of the world, you will find that people are organizing in lanes of uniform working direction. That means the opposite directions are separating from each other, and that creates kind of frictionless, very fluid, very efficient organizations. People don't have to stop very often. They don't block each other often. And it happens automatically, even without people having to think about it. So this is, in some sense, Adam Smith's invisible hand at work. There's no policeman. We don't need any regulations for this or laws. It's just happening. However, we know that when the density becomes too high, things can easily get out of control, such as at this crowd disaster in Duisburg during the Love Parade, where obviously nobody wanted to harm anybody, but in the end 21 people died and more than 500 were injured. In the very same way have we seen during the financial crisis that the markets that we often believe would self-organize themselves were suddenly failing and required government help. So if we push it too far in a complex system, then basically this invisible hand doesn't seem to work. So how would we be able to make it work? I'll come back to this later on, but I'd like to mention before that we are facing a number of similar problems that are characterized by systemic instabilities, such as every social dilemma situation where cooperation in principle would be good for everybody, but where it's better for you if all the others cooperate, but you don't, where you get an extra benefit for not cooperating. These kind of social dilemma situations tend to lead into an erosion of cooperation and finally a tragedy of the commons. And since hundreds of years, we're facing these kinds of problems, like environmental change, global warming. Okay, that's an issue that we discussed only for a few years or decades, but environmental pollution certainly is a very old problem, and we haven't finally solved it. Overfishing is another problem, not solved, and environmental exploitation. Just to mention a few, but also free riding, tax evasion, and so on are other problems of these kinds where, as I said before, cooperation would be good for everybody, but it's an unstable state, and that's why, similar to the crowd disaster I've shown before, this desirable state does not show up. We have to do something to stabilize cooperation in these kind of situations. And so, as it doesn't happen by itself, we have come up basically with laws and regulations, thousands of laws, tens of thousands in fact, and we still have the problem, by the way. So what I want to say is this failure of self-organization in the markets, in certain kind of circumstances, not always, of course, require basically a top-down control by politics. And of course we need police and courts and all this. And so we basically have a competition between the bottom-up organization of markets and the top-down organization of politics. But this attempt to control the situation top-down is apparently very expensive. Most industrialized countries, maybe with the exception of Switzerland, have huge debts of the order of 100% of the GDP, a whole year's production basically. Some countries even 200%, and it's not clear how long we will be able to pay our debts. So it seems that the system as we are organizing it today is coming to its limits, and we may have to come up with a new approach. And the question is, what would this new approach look like? For this, it's good to look back at the systems that we've had in the past and still today. So one of those systems is a centrally planned economy where we have a central planner who organizes the system in a top-down way and also regulates it in a top-down way. We've seen that as compared to the second type of economy, this has often been inefficient. So that's why we have in many countries a market economy, where we have a bottom-up organization, it means the self-organization of markets, but as I just explained, a top-down regulation by politics. This market self-organization is based on the concept of the Homo economicus, that means the independently deciding and utility maximizing individual or company, so everybody is just trying to get the best out of the system for himself or herself. And I'd like to argue that there is actually a third opportunity where we would have a bottom-up organization and a bottom-up regulation, and that if we would learn how to do this kind of organization, it would free up a lot of efficiency again, and it would be beneficial for our society. But this kind of approach assumes that people, companies would decide in an other regarding way. That means considering basically also the impact on the environment and on others. Now you could argue, okay, why should they do it? And the answer is because it's better for everybody. We have done computer simulations based on evolutionary rules, biological competition and mutation, that shows that under certain conditions such a Homo Sapiens can actually thrive and have better payoffs than the Homo economicus. So it's a completely different approach, and we have looked at that in detail in a different kind of system, basically traffic systems, where we also have the problem, as in our economy, that we cannot satisfy everybody's expectations at the same time. So some cars have to wait at the intersection. And then the question is, how do we basically distribute space and time and service capacity at intersections? And that is classically done by a central traffic control authority. That means by top-down regulation. But in principle, we could also do it in a different way if we let every intersection separately optimize, in this case, minimize the waiting times of the cars. And that would basically correspond to the approach of the Homo economicus. Now the third approach is that intersections would do exactly the same, but they would also stay in contact with the neighboring intersections and communicate with them in order to reach some coordination. And if it turns out the queues grow beyond a certain critical length, we would interrupt the minimization of the waiting times in order to reduce the queue length. Now this would correspond to the Homo Sapiens concept because its other regarding is taking into account what's going on at the next intersection. And let's have a look at how those three different systems perform. Now the red line actually corresponds to this top-down regulation, an optimal periodic service, and you can see the queue length as a function of the capacity utilization. It turns out that this approach is doing reasonably well, but the surface optimization, according to this concept of the Homo economicus, is doing much, much better actually. So in fact, the invisible hand kind of self-organization among those neighboring intersections works very well and further reduces the queue length. However, only up to a certain point, when the capacity utilization reaches about 60, 70%, suddenly we see that the queue length explodes and the principle of the invisible hand breaks down. While the Homo Socialis actually has all the benefits. It's performing as well as the Homo economicus, but also at high capacity utilization it still has a superior service for everybody. So the interesting point is that this decentralized self-regulation approach responds more flexibly to the actual traffic situation, and that's why it's outperforming even the centralized control. However, today we have more and more systems which a large degree of variability. For what reason planning is not a good strategy, and instead a flexible response is actually the superior strategy. In fact, Adam Smith was already aware of the social nature of human beings. He was saying in the theory of moral sentiment, however selfish man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render the happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it. So it would really be basically taking the next step, making basically this idea of self-organization work after 300 years, using data about human activity patterns, about production, about whatever is going on around us in the world. And the question, however, is, if we want to support such kind of other regarding behavior, if we want the Homo Socialis principle to thrive, then we need to have the right kinds of institutions, because in the context of homogeneous, anonymous markets, for example, the Homo Socialis cannot thrive. He will behave like a Homo economicus, and that means we will have to face all the tragedies of the commons that we have today. So we want to overcome them. We need different kinds of institutions, and I'd like to argue that social media are actually providing platforms that allow the Homo Socialis to thrive, that help people and companies to coordinate with each other and open up opportunities for self-regulation. And one important principle in that context is reputation. So reputation systems are spreading in our web very quickly, and that must have a reason. Here is the example of eBay. Scientists have studied actually the reputation system, and turns out it's good for sellers and it's good for buyers as well. Sellers can sell their products at a higher price if they have a high reputation, and buyers feel more comfortable about it and get a better service. So reputation systems are actually one of the principles that stabilize cooperation in social dilemma situations, and basically allow to create the feedback loops that allow better behavior to thrive, that allows companies to invest into quality and reach a situation where people would buy this higher quality. Of course, reputation systems do exist already, but at the moment, recommender systems are personalized in a way that creates something like a filter bubble. That means kind of a world in which we don't see all the reality anymore. We just see the reality that we like and that fits our taste. And that's a problem because it's manipulating our decisions, and we know that that is potentially undermining the principle of the wisdom of crowds, which is underlying democracies, but also financial markets. So we need the wisdom of crowds to work, and for this we need to make sure that we're not going to manipulate people's decisions too much. And we need to make sure that we keep up a high level of diversity. Now, big data, of course, has the potential to discriminate between different kinds of people. But we need to be careful about it. While you can certainly make money on this, no such algorithm is ever perfect, and so there are false positives and false negatives. And the false negatives are a particularly nasty case because those people who should get the benefit are not getting the benefit, and instead they're punished in some sense. So they pay a double price in some sense. And we need to make sure that we're not entering now an age of discrimination by using big data in the wrong way. We need to be aware that while diversity, of course, is challenging us, it's the driver of innovation. It's a base of societal but also economic resilience. And so it's really important for the functioning of our economy and of our society. And we need to learn to appreciate diversity. We need to protect it in the same way as biodiversity. And therefore, we need to make sure that the social media and everything else we build in the web will not reduce social diversity, but support it. Because that's the basis of our cultural evolution. And that's why I'm arguing for opening up a lot of the data, in particular of the rating and recommendation data, because we can't afford a company or an institution to decide for us what would be the right thing to do, what would be the music to buy, the movie to watch, and all these kind of things. We should be enabled to look at these data in our own way, with our own reputation filters that we can program, we can share, we can modify, and that will enable us to give a particular weight to those information sources that we value and trust. I mean, experts that we appreciate, friends, family, colleague, whatever. But I think for this to happen, we need to open up those kind of data, and that's what I'm arguing for. So for the age of big data to be beneficial for everybody, we need to open up the data. Thank you very much.
For a second talk, we'll have Javier Ruiz, who's from the Open Rights Group, and he will investigate more about privacy, I think.
Yeah, I think not coming here to play the official Cassandra role, but we just wanted to raise some of the issues that we've been considering around the privacy implications of open data in a very general sense. Just to let you know, before, the Open Rights Group is a fairly small non-profit organization that campaigns on lots of aspects around technology and rights, from privacy to copyright reform, where it affects freedom of expression, internet disconnection, access to data, open data. So we try to take a balance point. I mean, we are not a pure privacy organization. We are not a pure open data organization. So we try to really look at both sides. So, I mean, I just want to give like a very, very top overview of the things that we think are important to look at. I mean, just to understand from a legal point of view, then I don't have any slides, the relationship between privacy and access to information, which forms the basis for a lot of open data regulation. It's our understanding, and we take this mainly from the work of David Bannister, who's done international research on this, a comparison of different regulatory models, is that both aspects of the right to privacy and the right to information are human rights, and they have to be considered in a balanced manner. You can't say one trumps the other, no? So that's the starting point. They share some of the same legal basis, things like even when it comes to public information, there are legal doctrines that look at the access of your information that is held by the public sector. It's called habeas data. And these aspects are regulated in many, many ways in different countries. In the US, in the EU, there are many models. I don't want to go into detail, but just to get very clear that both have to be considered equally. And then, of course, you have this legal situation that gets complicated when you add all the technical aspects of opening data, which is not just giving access to information, but making it, on online technology platforms without control, with open licensing. That adds a whole set of problems. So just the type of problems that we see around open data and privacy are mainly come from two sides. One is when privacy becomes an obstacle to openness. And we've seen examples where that's happened, like farm subsidy, the project to give information around European Union subsidies, where there has been a ruling that says that individual landowners in Europe, well, normally most of them very rich individuals, cannot be named, and only companies can be named. So for us, from a perspective, that is a mistake, because there is a very clear public interest. A very clear public interest case there. In other cases, we see that the impact comes from the other way around. That I think is the main concern for, or should be the main concern for people in this conference, which is when, obviously, opening data has a negative influence on people's privacy. I don't know if you've seen a website in the US called mugshot.com, where basically you can go and find, if you've ever been arrested, or anyone who's ever been arrested in the US, you can find the information. You can argue that it's public information, and indeed is publicly available information. It's also private, it's also personal data from some people, but in the US that is allowed. And if you want to take your picture down, you can offer to pay several $100s to the owners of mugshot.com, and they will take it down for you. So it's definitely worth checking it. So those are so focusing on the second type of problem. What we see is that we see, for example, for a start, we see issues around the privacy of public employees. I mean, it's quite fashionable to say that the public sector has to completely open up, and I think we all agree that the salaries of ministers should be there, but we also agree that you should put probably a GPS on every bus or form of public transport. But would we be happy to put a GPS on the ankle of every postman and woman in the world and be able to track them as they do their rounds? Or is there a limit, to how much intrusiveness we take on public employees? Also, it's okay to, does every secretary in the public sector has to have their personal life, pulled over or open? So I think that that's something that we need to consider, because in general we take the view that public should be open, private shouldn't, and think that you need to look at public benefit and public interest cases. Then, for example, there are principles, we say, processes of selection, how far up in hierarchy people are. I mean, there are some criteria that you can use, but you definitely need to apply a test, to each individual case, we believe. So then the second case around privacy, obviously, is the privacy of citizens. And here we have the usual problems, identity theft, profiling, let's say, big data or even human profiling, and discrimination in the use of public services. And particularly in relation to public services, I mean, nowadays there is almost like an expectation that if you want to use some public services, you need to provide your data. If you want to use public transport in London, you need to buy, and you don't want to pay extortionate prices, you need to buy what's called an Oyster card. If you want to link that in a convenient way with your bank, that is linking completely, and the Oyster card is tracking every single movement that you make and all your history, and is being fed through security services pretty much constantly. So I think that there is a similar debate in terms of health, where the UK government is trying to feed a lot of personal history and from users of the National Health Service to private companies to run analytical trials to see if you can match particular lifestyles with cancer, things like that, which may be very useful, but shouldn't count with the agreement of those involved, to a point where we should have a proper debate and not just say there's a strong public interest case and we have to get over individual objections. And of course there's a public interest case. I mean, I don't know if it's worth Googling, the worst tragedy of the data commons, which is a really interesting article, looking at how, if people refuse to give their data, a lot of public interest research and very progressive things, like, for example, looking at the attainment of ethnic minority children and things like that, will just not happen. So of course we want the data to be out. The point is that we have a responsibility to do it properly, not just to argue and try to sneak in, clauses in big projects, the data will somehow magically be transferred. So we also need to look at one specific case of public interest is the public registers. And here, we think that public registers are a very specific case of open data privacy, nexus. There are calls you will hear, if you're here for the whole week, you will hear about public registers of beneficial ownership, I'm sure. That's one of the big campaigns of OKFN. And there are, obviously, we believe that that information should be open as much as possible, but we also need to do it right, and we need to look at, what are the implications, and to make sure that it doesn't become, again, one extreme position that now anyone, that registers a company has to be completely, fully transparent. Of course, there are some strong arguments for transparency. You are getting legal immunity or limited liability in exchange, and in exchange you are giving some of your privacy. But we need to really analyze it so it doesn't generate a backlash. There are, again, there are complicated cases, when we look at this, like what happens with private companies, location services, there's a huge issue, particularly in Europe, where it's not just covered by data protection law, but it's covered by what's called the e-privacy directive, that regulates location or what you can do with location data. So we have to really look at some specific types of data as well. So now, the solution to many of these conundrums around public data and personal data tends to be to say, well, we'll just anonymize everything. We'll just make sure that everything is anonymized, and then you won't be able to find any individual information out of the outputs, and that should be fine. And I'm sure, again, that if you're here, you've all heard of the problems with anonymization. There are some really huge scandals in the US, like AOL, browsing data, anonymized, shared with researchers. Midwest housewife, closet lesbian, found out, sues the company, wins like a massive amount of money from them. So you have to, there are problems with anonymization. Now, that doesn't mean that anonymization is absolutely 100% useless. I don't think we can argue that, but we have to understand that it's not a binary yes, no, it's anonymized or it isn't. No, it's about managing risks. And unfortunately, much of what you hear from governments and developing policy right now tends to be like, yeah, we just anonymize it and we've done away with the problem. And we don't think that that should be the line to take. So our proposal in terms of anonymization is that you need to have transparency, fundamentally. Try to use open source technologies, or particularly, so some third parties can examine the algorithms that you're using and the processes, and you need to build up social consensus around it. So that's the starting point, and it doesn't mean that it's going to work in every case, but at least you've tried your best. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention is that open data and transparency is now moving not just from the public sector, but also into people wanting to share their own data from social services. And that is, we think that is really good, and particularly if you want to share your data, you need to be able to control your data. And in Europe right now, we have a debate around data protection, the new data protection regulation that fundamentally is about that. It's about individuals being able to control their data, to keep it if they want, or also to share it. But if you don't control it, you cannot share it in the first place. So just those are the last words. Just to be aware that there are many people that talk about open data, and they really want to access personal information from individuals to make money. I think the open data community has to be very aware that you don't end up endorsing those perspectives which we think are fundamentally wrong. Thank you.
So while the connection is made for the next speaker, I just wanted to call if Ton Zisra is in the room. Yeah, I know some people are running other workshops. Maybe
I'm here.
you're Irina?
Yes.
Please come and join us.
Is there any chance I could go next? Because mine is really quick.
Sure.
I want to go
Or
back
would you-
to.
Is that fine with you?
Mine's quick too, so
Okay, let's do it that way, because I know you're running another workshop,
Yeah.
so you can have your take, and I'll just say a few words about Olodutun Baba Yemi, who had to join us from Nigeria, and unfortunately cannot make it because of visa problems, so we'll excuse him, and he will have a blog post on the OKFN blog So if you want to read about the presentation he had to do, you will probably will see it in the next few days. What he wanted to talk about. Is Sridhar Papisetti in the room? No. Okay. So sorry, Paul. We'll have to wait for another 5-10 minutes, and we'll listen to Irina Bolichevsky from the Open Knowledge Foundation about CCAN, the next generation of open data management. Is that right?
Yes. So I'm going to be very quick. I'm not going to present a whole presentation to you, but if you do want to find out more, you could look at ccan.org. Should I sit or should I stand?
Up to you.
Standing kind of mood today. But so we live in as everyone's been saying, we live in an increasingly digital age, firstly. So a lot of data is already produced by governments and civil societies and organizations. And the amazing thing is that the cost of sharing it with one other person is basically the same as the cost of sharing with thousands of people. You know, and this is really something that is kind of unique to our age, and so we really are seeing this kind of trend towards digital data management as opposed to just sort of content management. And CCAN is an open source project, so it's something that anybody can go and use and install. And I'm just gonna. People are tweeting me saying, "How's the workshop going?" Which is going well. And so CCAN does two main things. It allows users to find data across hundreds of thousands of data sets by having a full keyword search and facets and browsing and kind of being able to filter by locations as well as departments or countries. Actually, maybe I will show you. It also tries to work with governments and organizations to improve the quality of metadata and data publishing through a guided process of having step-by-step entry and validation at different stages. And so what we're really trying to do is we're trying to kind of connect the publishers with the reusers. And as long as we know that the data is openly licensed, and we provide sort of that central hub where everyone can go and sort of find the data, that really is the sort of the first step of getting people to reuse it. I think we still have a lot of issues where I think many of the publishers, especially government, really have a huge disconnect between the reusers. They don't often know who exactly the reusers are. There are these mythical hackers or these journalists or these civil societies who are going to create all these visualizations and make governments accountable. And I think there is a disconnect, but we really sort of try and kind of make tools that work for both and kind of balance that process. The really exciting thing that we have found is in the last year, I think in the last 2 years things have ramped up, but in the last year especially, the number of open data portals that have sort of sprung up around the world is phenomenal. It's really kind of become something that is amazing. And what we're really seeing with CCAN as well is that more and more people are using open source to pair with open data. And it's a product that is built on open standards. Everything, all the code's on GitHub, it can be extended, it can be reused for lots of different purposes. And it also has a powerful functionality to allow federation, so to allow interoperability between different catalogs so that the data can reach wider and wider audiences by putting the kind of link to it, or the metadata, the kind of pointers to the data across as many kind of search indexes as possible. So as well as providing that home to the data so that it has a unique URL and you can find it on Google, it's also kind of allows the data to be related to other local data. So what I really wanted to say is it's really cool. CCAN is really cool. It's being used by sort of the Brazilian, the UK, the US, the Canadian, the Australian, the German, the French, the Austrian, the Norwegian national portals, and more, even more local governments. There are now lots of organizations and universities using it we've managed to do a huge amount with a really small open source team and a big open data community. And I think we've really seen the fact that there's all these people in the open data space that are really actually motivated and excited to use open source tools and actually push their governments and communities to provide this, to really have been the big factor in the last year. The next chapter for CCAN is making it a fully independent international project. So we're actually looking for users of CCAN and governments and representatives to become CCAN project members and help support the project to make sure that it continues to work with open standards and it sort of really helps the infrastructure and backbone of open data, especially within government, to thrive. So please come talk to me if anyone is interested in that. That's it.
Thank you. So now we have the chance to hear Paul Stone, who is coming all the way from New Zealand. So thank you, Paul, for taking such a long trip. He's from the Ministry of Culture and Heritage, and we will talk about the new business as usual. Paul, it's all yours. Does that work? It's getting there. There. Almost. There.
Okay. Well, as you said, I'm Paul Stone. I'm from New Zealand, one of the most transparent nations in the world in recent times. We're so transparent that if you go to the transparency.org website and look at their world map, you won't even see us on there. I'm surprised you can even see me here on site. Oh, yeah, there we go, that's better. But being transparent doesn't mean we have everything sorted on the open government data front. We have many of the same challenges as everyone else. If you're here at the previous session and they talked about the challenges, they all seem very familiar. We are making progress though in releasing open government data, but the question remains, how do we sustain it? We believe the way to sustain the release of open government data is to ensure that it's embedded in what we call the new business as usual, to make sure that it's part of the everyday planning and processes of government agencies. It should just happen naturally. So I'm going to share with you briefly two strategies that we're applying in New Zealand to try and reach that new business as usual. Okay. The we I'm talking about is the Secretariat amongst this hierarchy of committees, which is where I work one day a week. Secretariat effectively plans and carries out the program with oversight from the steering group. The key strategy has been the appointment of data champion in every government agency. The chair of the steering group wrote to the chief executives requesting this appointment. What we were looking for in a data champion was somebody at executive management level, persuasive with their peers, involved in the organisation's strategic planning, and had a good understanding of their customers. But just having a data champion appointed isn't enough on its own. They need support and encouragement. So we've been providing this through various means. We've generated a toolkit on the web of guidance. We have one-on-one meetings with those data champions. We talk about what is high-value public data, the principles of open data, Creative Commons licensing. What do we mean by machine readable? Remembering these are executive managers. We give examples of data that's been reused in innovative ways. We then look at what data they have that in their organisations that could be released and talk about ways it could be reused, try and invigorate some enthusiasm. We talk about the challenges they have and how they might be overcome. And wherever possible, we connect them with other people, organisations across government that have either the same challenges or can help in some way. We've also been publishing case studies on the web that demonstrate the value of the release and reuse of data. we've been training on Creative Commons licensing, what it means to open up data in a legal sense. We've also had Statistics New Zealand, who are very paranoid about data privacy of the individual citizens. They've been training agencies on how to safely release data through aggregation and data privacy methods. We've also been monitoring every year for 2 years now. We send out a questionnaire to the data champions to fill out, and their responses form the basis of a report back to our cabinet ministers in Parliament. This questionnaire focuses not only on the data they've released, but perhaps more importantly, how they've incorporated open data into their strategies and business plans, and also what their plans are for release in the future. At data.gov.nz, you can make requests for specific data sets. We follow up through the data champions to make sure that those requests are responded to. Which leads me to our second strategy, which is getting to know our user community much better. So, in addition to pushing on the demand side, pushing on the supply side, we're also starting to focus on the demand. We want to get the user community to start pulling the data out of government through demand. We've had some contact with developer community so far through an organisation called open.org.nz, and we also have met and want to meet with economic researchers, scientific community, universities and data journalists. Through data journalists in particular, we hope that the human interest stories can be surfaced out of the data. This will in turn raise the awareness of the general public to provide, to make them see the value that's in the government data. And so in turn they'll demand more, and the journalists will go back to government agencies demanding more. So that's just very briefly and in yellow what I've been about. What we've been talking about in what we've been doing in New Zealand, and I'd really love to meet with anybody else doing similar work in other countries and connect with you over the next couple of days. Thank you very much.
Very interesting talks, I'm sure you agree. We had like super different points of views, a point of view more of a socio-economic model, how the society is developing and what are the future issues and opportunities that we have there. We have also a very nice introduction to this tension that has to do with the privacy and openness and the balance that we have to strike. And of course, and also a very interesting talk about how a government body approaches this issue of opening up data and how it develops this with its community. So I'd like to give you the opportunity to ask questions to our panelists. So please raise your hand, and who wants to ask the first question? Yes.
Question for Dirk. I come from a financial markets background, rating agencies and investment banks.
Right.
And now being in this open data world, I've noticed that there's a real difference in mentality. People in the financial markets are very, very interested in keeping information proprietary so that they can have a trading advantage. So do you see that as well, and how can we convince financial market participants to move away from that so that we can have the kind of participatory society that you're recommending?
The question is whether this proprietary advantage is really larger than the advantage we would create by opening up data. I'm not saying that opening up data would have to be necessarily for free. You know, it takes some money to create the data, to store them, to process them, and so on. So I think we need to find a fair deal. But certainly coordination among companies or among companies and customers creates new potentials that we haven't used in the past. And they could very well be bigger than those competitive advantages that you named. I'm not daring to make a prediction whether the proprietary use of data would go away over the decades, or whether we would just have a number of different models in parallel. So in principle, you could imagine that we have a number of different data universes in principle. Yeah, as we have it also with software, with different kind of licenses, and some of those licenses are open. But if you use what others have been producing, you don't have to pay for it. But whatever you're using it for and extend it, you should give to everybody back. So we are creating something like a common good. And so there are these different possibilities, and I think that we will have over time a number of parallel IPR universes. And I do think, however, that people are eventually recognizing those benefits of sharing, which we haven't been aware so much in the past. And from that point of view, I think the amount of business, not just business, also engagement in general, that is based on sharing data will grow largely as compared to the proprietary use of data. The other point is producing data will be cheaper and cheaper. We are now entering the Internet of Things, and that means we'll have millions or billions of sensors distributed everywhere. And in principle, we could buy those sensors and build up something like a common pool of data and just measure it ourselves. And with every neighbor, every person, every citizen is buying such kind of sensors. We could make ourselves independent of somebody charging us a lot of money for this kind of data. So competition will make, in any case, those data cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And if you now look at Spotify, how much you pay to listen to a song as compared to downloading it illegally, there is almost not a difference anymore. So that's quite interesting, and I think one should think about the implications of those developments.
Thank you. I think there is a question in the back and then one in the front here.
So I'd like to put just a counter-argument to that. I think also from the financial markets, but just in general. Yes, whilst you can say, I am here, I've taken a picture of this, I've measured the temperature. What you're talking about in the financial markets, which are crucial to all of us, but also in general, increasingly in our lives, are intangibles. It's very difficult to create your own version of an intangible, particularly because of the issues to identify. So, for example, the US stock, just those things that identify US securities are proprietary. And the problem is that whilst there may be benefits to the market as a whole in terms of opening up these things, most of the stock markets are private companies and they're basically proprietary. The people who are benefiting from proprietary identifiers, in particular, but proprietary systems and private data, are different people than those that would benefit. And so we have there's both a collective action problem in terms of getting all of these disparate actors to act together and say that we want to do something. And then there's also the gatekeeper role, and the people who are benefiting the gatekeeper are different from those that would benefit if these things were opened up. So I think it's not quite as straightforward. And you could argue that the same is true with music, and there are lots of people who benefit from getting DRM on music, but nevertheless the gatekeepers who have now tied in Spotify to their model, essentially, are the ones that have, at the moment, have won that battle.
All right, but why should it be possible, basically, if there are some beneficiaries and others who have to pay the price to kind of redistribute in a way that makes it a fair deal for everybody? If altogether that's creating a benefit, it's just a matter of who gets how much money for it, or how much credit points, or whatever it will be.
I think that's to misunderstand. I mean, the markets are to a degree based on asymmetries of access, asymmetries of information, and if you have that, then then you want to maintain that, and you have the power. Having that information, having the money that generates, and so on, gives you power, and so on. So I think that it's that efficient markets hypothesis, that is increasingly discredited. So I don't disagree that reputation systems are really critical. I don't disagree that actually we need to start working more, that we need to have a looser, less centrally mandated or approach. But I'm suggesting that there's a big gap there between saying that is a goal, that's what our end goal is to be, and where we are now. And I haven't heard the route for getting there, essentially, which I think is the most critical aspect.
Okay, I'd like to answer to this. First of all, regarding information asymmetry, my understanding of the functional principle of stock markets, to reach the fundamental price, to identify it, assumes basically shared information, open information, and information asymmetry often causes market failures. Yeah. We could argue about this forever, but this is not my main point. I think the main point is that we would like to create a platform where everybody can upload data, but also algorithms to mine them, and rating data and whatever. And you could do that for free, but you could also do it for a fee and say, okay, everybody can use the data, but I charge so and so much per kilobyte of data or whatever, and in this way we would create a global market data place, a data market, which would allow everybody to
maybe we should give people a chance to ask other questions. So I'd like to hear first you, and then this lady had a question too.
Yes. I would like to ask to clarify a little bit about regulation. In regulation, if we want to simplify, we've got the creation of the rules and the enforcement. So, your idea is in both stages or in one of them? And the second is, do you assume full information in web data? Do you assume that everybody has all the information airy? Because the main issue now is, call it computational social science. It's a very famous paper in Science saying that despite all the other sciences, in social science, there's no new data. In comparison to what behavior we're creating. Facebook, Google, they own the data. We don't have data for research. So full information hypothesis is getting away in the web, far away. So these 2 points.
So I imagine that would be something like a trusted organization, whether that's private or public or whatever, that would enable access to the data. Not necessarily personal data that could be sensitive, but at least it could run something like an aggregation algorithm and find out some statistics of the population or whatsoever. And everybody could do that, and it would cost a certain price or would be for free, whoever provides this kind of data. So basically it would empower every citizen, every company, every organization, institution, and government authority to use the data that is somewhere, So opening up in the sense of we could all mine those kind of data within certain limits and for a certain price. That's the main idea. And when we use Google today, it applies a certain algorithm, but we cannot decide about the algorithm that's being applied. And I think that would be the next step, basically, that we would not only be able to enter a certain search request, but also to decide what is the algorithm being applied to return me an answer to my question.
Thank you. Another question, and I ask you also to ask questions also to Javier and Paul, because we have to take this opportunity to challenge them a little bit. So.
Yes, I have actually a question to Paul.
Thank you.
And at the moment, there are so many governments starting data portals and so on. And in most cases, it's done by the IT department or information don't know about this, and that means that it's really a long way from the information administrator to the data champions. And so I think what many governments are really neglecting, that is kind of the internal marketing, internal education about why are we doing this? Because in many governments people think, oh, this is just additional burden to me, why should I do this? So how do you create these data champions? I mean, really, that they really want to do it.
Can I add, I was going to ask the same thing. Are these people overcoming hostility or apathy?
Yes. Yeah, they have a tough job. But yeah, the key reason is because the key reason the champions are there are to try and sell into their own organisation to champion the cause. They do come across animosity. Some departments more than others. Take Department of Corrections, for example. They've got lots of very interesting data to social policy analysts or researchers about the life of people going in and out of prison, etc. They are so holding on to that data. But the data champion is doing a sterling job in slowly breaking down those barriers. And examples is the greatest way to start breaking down those barriers. If you can give an example of how data has been cleanly anonymised to protect individuals, you know, and using some really difficult test cases where they've been in the public. You know, if you look, say for example, there's some timeline data of an individual that was very high profile in the media. He could have been very easily identified. Now, the data champion identified somebody within his staff that was very good with data, and he applied an algorithm to anonymise that data, and to the point where that individual's information was in with the rest, and you couldn't identify it, come higher without water, even though you knew so much about this individual anyway from the media. So it comes down to examples of the best way, and it's where we used case studies to try and show the benefit. A great example is, we get to fight that. Why do it? Who cares about our data? Classic example we use to counter that is it's a thing called Truckometer. One of our banks, ANZ Bank, the economists have used traffic volume data released from our transport agency. They found a strong correlation between GDP from our statistics agency, mashed it together. They are accurately predicting 6 months out what our economy is going to do. Companies from all around the OECD are using the Truckometer publication once a month to predict what's going to happen. We've got companies determining when to buy and sell stocks based on that. Go to New Zealand Transport Agency and say, did you imagine this data was going to be used like this? No way. And so an example like that, give it to others that have got data and they're going, why should we release it? We say, just get it out there, let the innovation happen, don't try and control it.
Yes, please.
Just building on that point, so I guess much of what you've spoken about so far is about dealing with the supply side of data, about getting data out. It's been quite a common approach by governments around the world, and I'm from the UK, and that's what all ministers talk about, is kind of getting the data out, getting the data out. But I'm interested to hear if you're doing anything on the demand side as well, because of course there are people who will use data once it's out, but that group of people is quite small at the moment. And if we're going to the road between open data to transparency and open government is quite a long one, and it requires a much broader kind of group of people to be able to scrutinise data and to actually be able to use it for the ends of open government. So I'm interested to hear whether anything's happening on that side in New Zealand.
Yes, that's where I talked about we're going out to economic researchers. So they are people that we know use data, but we go out and talk to them about what data it is that they use, and what do they want to use that they can't get hold of, what are they finding barriers to getting to. Like for example, it wasn't until we talked to them that we found out that there are high uses of our treasury data, publication of accounts, but there's 1/4 of the year which the Treasury refuses to release the data because they're too busy focusing on the government budget. Now that's a cause of great frustration to the analysts and the economic analysts, because that's a chunk out of their picture, and they have to basically invent the rest, or they can't finish the job. So that was an opportunity for us to go back and talk to the Treasury and say, hey, there's an opportunity being lost here because you're being stubborn about being busy. If you can do it, you should systematise things more, so that if you're doing it 9 months of the year, you can do it the other 3 years without, the other 3 months of the year without much extra effort. So it's, getting out and thinking from our program's point of view, we're thinking about who are the potential users. So that's from the scientific community. There's so much government data in the scientific realm. Going out and talking to businesses, talking to media companies, and not just the data journalists, but talking to media companies. We've also talked to journalism training organisations, the whole picture of data journalism, and essentially invigorated data journalism in New Zealand simply by going out and starting the conversation. It's identifying sets of people that you target, rather than trying to get to every possible individual that might use the data or just relying on crowdsourcing. You actually need to target sectors, if you like, of potential users. Think about how they might use it. Go and talk to them and find out what they would use if they could get it. And then that way you can go back and talk to the agencies and say, hey look, you're wondering who is going to use our data, or who you are. These guys might.
Thank you. We had another question. Oh, sorry. There was this gentleman and then you. Sorry.
Thank you. So Paul, I wonder if you, and which is what I was reminded of listening to your talk of U.S. data officers that I think they are political appointees in government agencies taking charge of pushing open data in various agencies. If you have looked at it, and so that's one question. A separate second question is that when you say new business as usual, it reminded me at one side it's like a website. It's so usual for any government agency to have a website. It's almost unthinkable not to have one. and at some point, open data might become something like that. But at the same time, it costs money to develop a really sophisticated website or the data set. So when it becomes a business as usual, it almost sounds like you will disregard the cost-benefit aspect of the operation. And is that really a good thing? So those are the questions.
Well, the first thing, our data champions are probably similar to what happens in the US, just a little less official. It was more of an informal, from our steering group committee, a formal letter, but an invitation to appoint somebody. Now we're fortunate that we had 100% uptake, so that was a good start. And on the other question around mental block, what was it? Business as usual, yes. So what I really imagine there is that if it's embedded in the everyday processes, then it doesn't cost you anything to release the data. That's one thing. Because if you're publishing an annual report, if you're spitting out the CSV files along the way, instead of formatting your spreadsheets and publishing a nice PDF, you're creating the data set, simple data sets alongside it and releasing it at the same time. That's the other thing, is that it doesn't have to be an expensive API. Application Programming Interface, are really useful, but not all data is necessarily released that way. There are static data sets that can just be put up and accessible on the web. So the analogy you were talking about the website, I actually talk about that with our data champions as well, saying we were so much focused on publishing to print in the past, and then in the 80s and 90s we've got this new strange thing called the website, and we all put up a website, and then before we know it, everything gets, that required a different approach to publishing. You wrote your reports differently, knowing that they were going up on the web. And now it's just become natural. It's exactly the same thing with open data. If you think about open data at the start of the process, it's very easy to release it as open data at the same time as publishing on the web and the printed document. So,
thank you.
I come from the e-government program of Saudi Arabia, and one of the
trends we are seeing in Saudi Arabia along with countries in the neighborhood like United Arab Emirates is there is a sense of dual licensing, commercial activities between regulated industries like telecommunications and governments, insurance companies and the governments. And there is a lot of commercial data exchange happening. That number one adds to a lot of barrier to entry for open data for the public, because it's all between government to government or between government to businesses. And secondly, the overall, how do I put it, the overall aspect of selling open data as a concept of having, you can say, delayed economic value addition as compared to direct commercial transactions of data between organizations, it's not easy to sell. How, the whole panel, I would ask the question, because all of you have touched on important subjects related to that, is how would you go about entering into the market and evangelizing open data where you see commercial data trends happening between government to businesses and government to government?
Maybe we can give a chance to Javier, and then maybe Dirk and Paul can add.
We have been complaining about this in the UK. For example, there's a case right now around the VAT data and whether that information should be fully open or shared with certain companies. And I don't think that, I think that it goes back to the original, to the first question from Mark here, which for me the answer is that you can have an open data revolution without making some enemies, basically. That's clear, is that. And I think some people are, you are going to have to fight incumbents and interests at some point. If there are some contracts. We just had the review of public sector information regulation in Europe, and some people were arguing that, all this, there are lots of clauses, allowing for exclusive deals, exclusive agreements, for sales of data. And the principle, if you give people a clause, that allows that, many people will take it. So I think at some point you need to talk about from government, trying to make clear policy that you've changed, times have changed, and you need to move to an open data model, and the other contracts are going to be given 5 years or whatever, and we hold it. I don't see any other solution.
Paul, you want to add something?
Yeah, well, our response to that is if the public is paid for it, it's theirs. End of story. If government has generated data through the course of its business, it's been publicly funded, it should be made available to them for free. And so if you're making it available to the public for free, you make it available to commerce for free as well. And an example of putting that into practice was our Department of Land Information New Zealand used to sell their data to business. And it was all about 200 layers of information, geospatial information around New Zealand. And they applied that principle and